Well, let's begin with a prayer, and then we're going to continue in our series. Lord, I give you thanks and praise for who you are and what you mean to us, and how you've given us order and purpose and meaning in this earthbound sojourn. We pray for wisdom as we reflect upon the seasons of life. In Jesus' name, amen. This is our second session on Thomas Cole's Voyage of Life series, and some of you may wonder if I'll ever get to the paintings, but there's a reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm trying to set the background and set the stage so you will greatly appreciate the paintings more than perhaps you otherwise would have. So I'm kind of doing some reflection, and in our first session, I was talking about the cycles of birth, growth, decay, and death that recur, and that they recur on 5 levels as I see it. A day is a birth, growth, decay, and death. You wake up this morning, you begin to develop your energy, and then you begin to decay, and then tonight you go to your burial chamber, which is your bedroom. You pull your shroud over your head, which is your sheet, and you go into death-like state called sleep. And so it's a symbol, you see, an awake sleeper and Christ will rise on you, or he will rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. That's the concept, you see. So you are kind of given a new day. Every day is all you've got. Each day is all you've got. This is the only time you have. You don't have the past, you don't have the future. And so then we have this idea of a year, and of course the natural cycle. So you have the spring, you have the summer, you have the fall, and then it's decay into winter, and then the spring again. It's not an accident then that the resurrection took place in the spring. It was the beginning, it was a new birth. And then you have a life, and so we have our sojourn in this earth as a life, but also nations have their 4 phases as well, and certainly civilizations as well. So the picture then of this would seem from one point of view to be, golly, it's just going around in circles, you see. It just seems to be heading nowhere. And indeed, this was the Eastern concept of just moving around and around. These in the theory in India, for example, they had these Mahayugas, which were these massive amounts of time that were almost incomprehensible, and everything was in a cycle. And in the West, though, especially the biblical vision, said that there's a telos, there's an end, there's a direction to history. It's not just going in circles, but there's a sense in which the circles do go there. Remember Ecclesiastes 1, but in another sense, the circles are moving around and heading somewhere. We're going somewhere. History is not just one recurring event. And so we explored that a little bit, and then alluded to the Voyage of Life series, as of course you have the birth, growth, decay, and death. So you have childhood. The second painting is that of youth and his prime, as it were. Then manhood, and then old age. And we'll explore that. But I want to go a little bit further with you and describe a few other things as well. Also, we talked about poetry, and used poetry as an exemplar as well of this whole struggle that we all face with this earthbound sojourn, and we discover our lives, there are 3 ways of interpreting our lives in this planet. One would be futility, and I used 2 poems to illustrate. We just go around and around, get the most of what you can because it's going to be over. And so we're just going around, you're going to die, and that's about the end of it. And so I used John Webster's All the Flowers of the Spring, and also Robert Herrick, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. That's why he said that age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worst and worst times to still succeed the former. So then be not coy, but use your time, and while you may go merry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. You see his idea, get the most what you can, you are going to be out of here soon. But that's a kind of a futility, isn't it? A second approach then about this process, maybe there's more to it. Is there a way of achieving immortality somehow through art, through achievement, through endeavor? And artists would do this, but people try to do this by constructing empires, whether business empires or actual literal empires, it doesn't matter, and try to name places after ourselves and all these things, but it's again a futile quest, because in the caverns of eternity, you might as well write your name on water. That's how permanent it'll be from an internal perspective. So, but I used William Butler Yeats' sailing to Byzantium as an illustration of the quest to achieve immortality through a disembodied state, but rather through artistic achievement. But then it goes nowhere. And then I used a third approach in poetry. And the third approach, it's not futility, nor will you find your immortality in artistic or other attainments. Immortality is not the issue here. You see, our whole perspective is different. This earthbound sojourn is preparation for eternity. And seen that way, then, it changes all the rules. So John Donne's Death Be Not Proud and George Herbert's Vanity, these two transcendental poets, then illustrate this theme that actually you're not trying to gain immortality. You already are an immortal being. You're an eternal being having an earthbound sojourn. So you are a spiritual being in this embodied state for a brief period of time to prepare you for eternity, for your citizenship. And so we are in a soul-forming world, and it's a very different orientation that you have when you consider that approach to life. Now let me give you yet another approach, because I'm kind of layering some thoughts together for you to give you ways of looking at this theme, and then I'm going to be as well looking at another series of paintings by Thomas Cole called The Course of Empire. And there are 5 paintings that he did prior to doing The Journey of Life. And it's intriguing to see what they look like as well. And then, beginning next week, we'll go into the actual journey of life. Well, I think we will. But I wanted to do something that might seem rather strange at first. I want to talk about the idea of the Celtic cross and also the high cross, and how this too illustrates the motifs we've been talking about. In the ruins of the Abbey of Monasterboice, it's in the County of Louth in Ireland, there are 3 high crosses. They're called high crosses. And at the base of one of them, there is actually a prayer, an inscription that says, "A prayer for Murdoch, who had this cross made." Now, Murdoch, we don't know quite who he was, because there was a king in that era, and there was also a couple of abbots in the monastery. But it wasn't Murdoch who made the cross, he had it executed. But you see, this work was again anonymous, but it's called after the one who commissioned it, evidently. But there was a great deal of symbolism that takes place in this period of time. Sorry, I didn't mean to go there. And so if we consider this a symbolism, let me just explore what this looks like for you. So, get this thing going here. We gotta go, sorry, get there. And then, so this is what it looks like, and if you explore this theme of this cross here, they're actually quite beautiful. Amazing structures, and this is one of 3 high crosses that are there. And if you zoom into these crosses, then you see the center face. You'll have an east side and there's a west side, and so there are different symbols that are attached to this. But what's interesting about these crosses is that they're based upon something that was from pre-Christian paganism, and it was called the sun cross. So this is before then any Christian imagery. This is pre-Christian paganism. But it'll be intriguing to see how then the monks adapted that and modified it and transcended it, as we'll see. So let's just take a quick look at this and see what this looks like, because you see this theme in Celtic and Germanic and Slavic traditions with this sun cross was that it represented not just the sun, but the whole world. And so in this sun cross then, the cross pointed to the 4 cardinal directions. And so the south would be on the top, you see, and then you would have the north, and then the east and the west. So those are the 4 cardinal directions. And the vertical line that you see here, this vertical line, would represent what was called the world tree. Interesting motif, this. So it would connect heaven and earth and the underworld as well. This was a motif that you find in much of that period of time, the idea of the heavens and the underworld being connected. And so the vertical line then with this understanding, it ties the worlds together, and the bottom was anchored in this underworld. It was the realm of the dead, and the top reached into the heavens. And what we see here then is the realm of the gods. So this was the theme at that time as well. Now, the horizontal line was what's called Middle Earth. You may have heard that term. So Tolkien wasn't making it up. It was the idea of Middle Earth, was that understanding of this realm of time that we understand. It's between the lower and upper worlds, and all that exists was thus symbolically represented in this diagram. So along with the underworld, then the roots of the trees are connected with what would be thought of as ancestral wisdom and tradition, while the top of the tree had celestial wisdom, you see. And so you had the combination, the divine wisdom and ancestral wisdom that would be combined together. And the sources of all the knowledge were then all included, all sources of knowledge included in the symbolism. And beyond this, time is also represented in the diagram. Consider, for example, the daily cycle. So the daily cycle, which would be nice writing there. The daily cycle would be basically a movement into the, let me just do it another way here and get it this way here. See? We'll do it this way. Okay. This. So the daily cycle would be, you'd start with dawn, and then as it moves around the calendar, it would be noon, and then it would be sunset, and then it would be midnight. So you can see you're going around on a cyclical basis on every day. But then there would also be an annual cycle. So you would have then the spring, the summer, autumn, and winter. So again, it symbolized that. So it was a multiple kind of symbolism. And yet third, there was a life cycle. So you would have basically birth, the spring, then you'd have youth, then you'd have maturity and old age. Does that sound familiar? It should. That's the 4 paintings by Thomas Cole. So it's intriguing. And what I'm trying to do is contextualize. This is a major theme that has been unified together. And it's this life cycle then, where you have the circle of time. And so the circle that encloses the cross speaks of the circle of time. As day turns to day, an endless cycle, year turns to year, and then human life is passed on to the next generation. So the sun cross then represented far more than the sun. It pointed to all of space, and all of time, and all of the knowledge of the wisdom of the heavens, on earth, and under the earth. You see that, how comprehensive that's been. Now, Irish monks, possibly on the sacred island of Iona, took this very well-known image, and they transformed it from its pagan origins into a very powerful symbol for the gospel. And so what we see here then is this. They took then this what we call the Celtic cross, the Latin cross, and they took this cross then, and they superimposed over the ancient mandala of the cross, using the Latin cross as their model, and this is where the Celtic cross comes from. And so in that understanding then, this proclaims Christ now as the Lord of space and time. You see how they're repurposing that sun cross. Now Christ is the Lord of space and time. And he too is the fount of all wisdom, of all knowledge. He rules over all things, and from this cross. And so the Irish saints' vision of the gospel, of the kingdom of God, and of Jesus' authority over all places and times, then in every moment of our lives, was symbolized in this kind of an image. And so it would appear in these stone crosses in this manner. Now, there were also these high crosses in Ireland, and they took it even further, because these high crosses actually were related to what were called these menhirs. Let me see, I'll go back to here, okay? And these menhirs, they were called in this manner a menhir. Menhirs were very strange stones that are found throughout the countryside. These enormous standing stones, particularly in Ireland and Britain and Brittany. And they date back perhaps to 6,000 or 7,000 years to Neolithic periods. So this is well before the Celts were there. And no one really knows what they were, where they came from or why they were there. It was believed at that time that these were set up by the giants who lived before Noah's flood, is the idea here. But no one knows their real purpose. But they were incorporated because the Celtic people began to use them in their religious practices. And then when Ireland became Christianized, some of the old pagan holy sites were converted to churches and converted to monasteries. And the standing stones had no real use anymore. So what they would do then, we know, is that they began to repurpose them. They started to transform these menhirs into carved crosses. And we know this because we actually have some of them that remain unfinished. So it's an interesting thing, again, that you have these themes. So this provides yet another meaning, because with the high cross now, just as the Celtic cross represented the reinterpretation of the Christianization of the Sun Cross, so the high crosses, they're visible images of the triumph of Christianity over paganism. It's a kind of a symbolic notion. And the popular metaphor in the Middle Ages was that just as the Israelites plundered the wealth of the Egyptians in the Exodus, remember they gave them all their gold and silver and all these other things, so also the Irish monks were plundering the wealth of their pagan forebears in the creation of these high crosses. They were spoiling the Egyptians, as it were. And so they were beautifully decorated with biblical scenes, with geometrical patterns, and with images from nature carved all over the faces. They're all unique, and they're all anonymous. Only Merodach's cross has a name associated with it, and that's the patron, though not the artist. All are worth studying, but I want to focus and zoom in on this particular cross. So I'm going to be taking you through this very quick description this as well. So on the east side, most of the images come from Jesus' passion and resurrection, and then we have other images of the Last Judgment on the west side. And so if we take a look at some of these then, so we have this picture then of the Passion, and let's just explore. This is the west side then, with the central crucifixion scene, and then a little bit zooming in a little bit closer to that scene here, and then we have. So let me just go back a little bit here. Just go back to this one here, and get you that. Okay. So in this image here, there's a young beardless Christ who occupies the center. And this is typical in medieval and Irish depictions. He was the Christus triumphans, the idea of the alive and without suffering. And above his arms are two angels. You can see the two angels right over here, right like that. And above and below the scene are spiral bosses and intertwined animals. And so you have this idea, two soldiers are stand symmetrically on the side of Christ. One's the spear bearer, and then the other one pierces his arm, his left side. The other holds up the sponge bearer. And so there are different motifs that are used in these. And then on this particular detail on the right side of the material, you have an image of the right cross, the resurrection, what you have there is the guards kneeling on each side of the tomb, and the three angels are holding in a napkin and a small figure representing the soul. And then Christ is seen below the crosses as the ruler of the world, and so he's between St. Peter and St. Paul, and he gives the keys to Peter on his right and a book to Paul. And then there's the doubting Thomas scene as well, where he puts his finger in his side. And the figure on the right may be St. John the Evangelist. We're not sure. Again, we're trying to interpret this. It's amazing, this kind of level of artwork that was done anonymously and so forth, and each one has a meaning. This is the rest of Christ, the ecce homo. And then we have as well the lowest part of the shaft, where two felines, one with a kitten, the other with a bird, sit in high relief before an inscription, which is translated a prayer for Merodach, for whom the cross was made. And so intriguing how these things were made. Now we go to the other side, go to the east side of the cross, and the east side depicts several seemingly disparate Old and New Testament subjects. It's interesting how they chose, and no two of these crosses are alike. It's what's intriguing here. So what we see here on this east side of the cross is a portrait of the Last Judgment. And so you see Christ then, again, in a picture of authority. And the idea here of him being on the left of Christ, an angel blows the trumpet, is the right figure has an open book, and so forth. Then there's a detail of the Last Judgment, and also the weighing of the souls. And they called it the sukostasis, below the central scene. Then here's the scales of justice. A righteous soul, generally the heavier one, is in one pan, and there's a devil who had tried to tip the scales in the ground, attacked by St. Michael. It's intriguing how they had all this symbolism. Here's the adoration of the Magi, with an old bearded Joseph in front, as it appears to be, in front of the Magi, and then the three Magi are behind him like this, ready to bow down in this modality here. And then another scene here is Moses drawing water from the rock. Why did they choose this sequence? Or the next one is a scene of David and Goliath. The next one is the scene of the fall of Adam, and also the death of Abel. So all these kinds of themes are intriguing, aren't they? They point to something that each cross will reveal a kind of a history, a kind of a way of seeing this. So this cross is thus more than a simple statement. It's much more than that. It is something very powerful. It's a very powerful portrait then of something that's very meaningful. Let me just pull this back here and get you back to this cross scene itself. So what we see here then is something that it is Christianity, its triumph over paganism, or a worldview statement about the lordship of Christ, but its imagery has a rich theology because it connects the Old Testament with the New, and it shows also the sweep of history from the fall through the redemption to the eternal state. Very comprehensive when you can put that together. So this cross didn't change the world, but it reveals a world that was changed by the gospel. And it shows the passion as well as the zeal of these Irish believers who changed their world through their scholarship and their missionary activity. Thomas Cahill's book, for example, How the Irish Changed Civilization, comes to mind because it's more robust than we would have ever imagined, and God sovereignly preserved things through them. So it's a nearly perfect melding of art as well as the biblical worldview. And of course, as you know, we are incarnate beings then. We are spiritual beings having this earthbound experience, but we are called in the biblical vision of life. It's the most incarnational vision of all. It affirms the goodness, even though it's fallen, and the beauty of this created order. And it reveals as well that we have a sensorium that we can use to the glory of God. And so all of our senses can be used in this way, and all of our skills can be used this way, so that art and music and literature, all these things can be done solo Dei Gloria, as Bach actually put on his own inscriptions and much of his music as well. And this is really a theme that I'm focusing on. They proclaim loudly and clearly, then, that Jesus is Lord of time and space, He's the source of wisdom, and He is the transformer of culture. So that just gives you an idea of where we're going with that. So that's this cross, and then we move on to another theme. Now I'm getting back to Cole. And I want to talk briefly about what was called the Course of Empire series that he did before he did the Voyage of Life series, 1834 to 1836. And you can see there'll be 5 paintings, and so there'll be the savage state, and then there's the Arcadian or the pastoral state. Then there's the state which is called desolation, and then destruction, and finally the consummation of empire. So in this series then, once we have one of Cole's motifs, that he achieved what he described as a higher style of landscape, and what was something that was suffused with historical associations. There was moralistic narrative, and the artist felt were universal truths that could be captured in this manner about humanity and about our abiding relationship with this natural world. And so he had a patron who actually funded this. He made a proposal, as it were. And he proposed a series of pictures, as he wrote, that might be painted that should illustrate the history of a natural scene, as well as the epitome of man, showing the natural changes of landscape and those affected by man in his progress from barbarism to civilization, to luxury, to the vicious state, or a state of destruction, and then a state of ruin, and then of desolation. And he said, the philosophy of my subject is drawn from the history of the past, wherein we see how nations have risen from the savage state to that of power and glory, and then fallen and became extinct. So he took a trip to Europe in 1829 to 1832 and profoundly affected his work. And there he first saw the ruins of ancient civilization, remnants of this past time that couldn't be found in America. It gave him an entirely different vision, and it shaped his work moving forward. And certainly we see this in all of his subsequent paintings. And so in this idea, he was influenced by a poem by the British philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, called Verses on the Prospect of Planning, Arts, and Learning in America. And it alludes to the 5 states of civilization and the implicit prophecy that America would prove to be the next great empire. So he saw this. And he knew that America was on the verge of another civilization of greatness. So it's kind of anticipatory, isn't it, of that understanding. And there's a work by Lord Byron called Childe Harold, and he cited these verses regarding his series. He wrote, this is the poem. There is the moral of all human tales, 'tis but the same rehearsal of the past. First freedom, and then glory, then that fails. Wealth, vice, corruption, barbarism at last. And history, with all her volumes vast, hath but one page. So he's saying effectively, all the civilizations follow the same basic course, the same basic pattern. And so as Cole then wrote to his patron, I've been dwelling on many subjects and looking forward to the time when I can embody them on the canvas. They are subjects of a moral and religious nature. When such, I think it is the duty of the artist to employ his abilities, for his mission, if I may so term it, is a great and serious one. The work ought not to be a dead imitation of things without the power to impress a sentiment or enforce a truth. So let's explore this together and just look at some of these paintings that we have in the course of empire. So here we start with what's called the savage state, is what's being described here. And so what you see right at the center of this, you see this at the center of the painting here? There's a mountain, and it has a precariously propped boulder right on top of it. And that, of course, symbolizes the precarious nature of human endeavor. It's that boulder and that mountain will be in all 5 of the paintings. It's a central piece. So, of course, what Cole is doing then is teasing out through art and through symbolism and so forth, a portrait of the human condition writ large because of the collective aspirations of cultures and civilizations. And so we start then, we begin then with this central theme here of this enormous boulder and this painting at the center. And Cole's conception of a primitive was this nomadic hunter. You see him there? Make sure you can see it. Good, I'm glad it's working out well. I was hoping you could see the details of the painting. I had to do some tricky things to make it work this way for you, but it did. Okay, I'm happy to see that. And he's just shot a deer, and in the distance then you can see the deer is, if I can find a little creature here, there, you see? And he's been shot. And it's an image then, a deer imaged by the man's arrow, injured rather, our human efforts to dominate nature, and this becomes a theme here, the bow and the arrow. The ghostly filter of a figure of this hunter is also something that he reworked and so forth. And in this encampment, there's also, if you look in the distance here, an encampment with teepees. And this was basically a scene from The Last of the Mohegans. It was kind of borrowed. He was influenced by James Fenimore Cooper, and they knew each other. And Cooper loved his work and felt that it was remarkable indeed. In fact, I think I have a quote by Cooper where he was speaking about the incredible paintings and how meaningful they were to him. I don't think I can find the quote. But at any rate, we have this imagery here with the teepees and so forth. And then we also see storm clouds. And these storm clouds, they're there to symbolize the wildness of nature. Nature dominates. That's the theme that we've got here. And then primitive canoes then are an allusion to the beginning of the civilization as well. See if I can find I know where the canoes are. I think they're down here. But at any rate, we've got these little canoes he's got here, and he's got as well transportation, exploration. The hunter-gatherer stage, people have banded together for mutual necessities of protection, of sustenance, and for worship. And then we go to the next painting in the series, and it's called the Arcadian or Pastoral State. Once again, there's our mountain, a little bit more remote. But in this state here, what we have then, the mountain that was first seen in the savage state is more subdued, and it really symbolizes something. You notice this Stonehenge kind of building, and it's an imagery of the beginning of monumental architecture and religion. And the farmer replaces the hunter-gatherer. You see the farmer here. So he's replacing the hunter-gatherer. It's a sign of permanent settlement. In addition, there's an old man who's drawing figures in the dark. And this, in the dirt rather, and that symbolizes, I think, the beginning of science and logic. There's a kind of a mindset here of how we're becoming more conscious of these themes. And a young boy over in this portion of the painting, then he's drawing a stick figure of a woman who's holding a spinning distaff, which symbolizes the origins of drawing and of painting. And so you look, and Cole's name is seen underneath the boy on the bridge as well. So you have all these little motifs that take place. There's a tree stump that you see, and that already is a disquieting harbinger, isn't it, of things to come, the taking over of nature by the artifice of man. And then men and women who are dancing, the beginning of music. A permanent settlement now replaces the teepees. So you go over here and you see the smoke arising from houses. So there's a permanent now, not just teepees, and a far more impressive conveyance on the sea. So you have a much more sophisticated kind of boat. These are more advanced ships. And then we see as well a boy tending a flock of sheep. So all these are a type of landscape depiction. The pastoral is what we're dealing with. There's still a fundamental harmony, isn't there, to some degree with nature that's being symbolized, but a bit of a slight conquest, as it were, a taming of nature. And then we go to the third painting, and the third is a very different thing entirely. This is called destruction. And there's much to be seen in this painting. So here, the mountain is there again, and there's the boulder, still precariously sitting on top of the mountain. And what you see here as well, it's really a kind of a sense, the nature is never going to be finally overcome. It'll be the one that'll survive when we come and when we go. So it's the chaos, it echoes the chaos of the empire's destruction in the form of storm clouds. And the porch of this Doric temple, interestingly enough, so you see this Doric temple, the porch becomes the actual base for a catapult. You see? So it indicates that the violence of civilization has conquered art and religion. And then the bridge that once supported a decadent ruler now collapses, as it were. You see it's collapsing here. So he went across here, this bridge, and now it collapsed under the weight of the stones. The ships that once promoted trade and exploration, now they're burning, and they're burning, and they've sunk in the throes of war. There's a sculpture of an armed warrior that's very predominant in the foreground here, and this was really of the Borghese gladiator in the Louvre that he'd seen, you see. So again, he's been profoundly affected by all of his travels. A mother mourns the loss of her son. And it may be referring as well to the Géricault's a painting, the Raft of the Medusa, but she's mourning the loss of her son. And here is a woman who's fleeing from a soldier, and she's going to be jumping to her death to escape being raped by this soldier. Once again, the collapse of civilization into sexual violence. And the painter's signature on the pedestal then. So here we are, Thomas Cole, 1836, and it's really a symbol of his alliance with the arts themselves, with something that creates rather than that which destroys. Then the next painting. So now we move into the course of empire, but now we're dealing with what we call desolation. And in desolation, we see that civilization is beginning to return to the natural state. It's always interesting, isn't it, how nature reclaims slowly the ruins of empire. And although this is a sign of a civilization's end, the architectural fragments have a kind of melancholy beauty. We see this all over the world, in all areas, even with the Mayan temples and so forth, and how the forests overtake it and so forth. There's a kind of a melancholy sense of that lost, what once was, is the theme that's there. So what you have here, the moon, is confirming the time of day as evening, and it completes the cycle because with the savage state, that began at dawn. What are we doing again? We're going around the cycle of time and the cycle of nature, the cycle of civilization, the cycle of a person's life. Now there's a bird that's building its nest in the column, and it supports that, it was supporting a temple or a palace. and the mate drinks from a pool of water below. And then we have nature slowly reclaiming. And again, we see these ruins recall that something that there are things that he sketched during his trip to Europe. And then this is depicted then in a sense of the remnants of the frieze. And so if you go to this this theme here, let me just go to here. Yes, okay. So I want to make sure I've got the right one. Yes, okay. So what we see here then in this film, rather in this painting then, is kind of a loss. The dignity that was gone, and the nature's life cycles are now more powerful than anything that was constructed by human hands. And yet, the fifth and final one, the consummation of empire, is quite remarkable, because here it's come back in a new state. And so human structures now cover the mountain. The mountain's still there, but it's now covered by these artifacts. And if you go to the frieze, for example, you'll see in this temple the scenes of hunting, very similar to the hunting scenes that were found in the first painting as well. The image Diana, Roman goddess of the hunt as well. And then we have incense and all kinds of themes. That the image of a grandiose ruler seems to be one who is appearing here, because he's riding on the back. He's riding on this processional here that's being pulled by an elephant. Can you see him right here, the elephant right there? So that's the theme there. And so there's a kind of a sense here of an unflattering allusion, perhaps to the current president. Some may suggest that as well, Andrew Jackson. Whether that's true or not, there's spears that are here as well, and all kinds of components here. Military garb, suggesting a militarized society. The statue of Athena symbolizes war and victory. And a philosopher is interesting here, because there's a philosopher who is standing there in the scene, and he's surveying the scene. And Cole's signature, you see it there? Right, just so you can see it right here. Cole's signature is there, and it's carved into the stone that seems to suggest that he identifies with this figure's detached observation. And then we see as well this potted plant here. Again, something that he saw, the Borghese vase, and in the Louvre. Two boys who prefigure the world, what's going to be coming as well, the events to come. It appears that these two boys are playing and amicably, but the older boy is actually sinking the younger boy's ship. So again, all these are little symbols that he throws in here. And then he's got a scholar. You see him in the bottom of the painting here? He's recording history as it happens. And it's parallel to Cole's role in creating another kind of record through painting. The imagery of the fountain as well. Human manipulation and diminishment of moral of these elements. And so and then these brass trumpets. So everything's brazen, everything's overwrought, overblown, as it were. So if you go back and see these paintings, then you see a pristine state virtually conquered by, first of all, a pastoral arrangement with nature that seems to be amicable, but then it becomes something that gets more and more powerful until finally it's destroyed by war, its remnants, and then finally a kind of a return, a fierce return. And then that too, as you can predict, it too will be overthrown. So what is this telling us then? As we're going to be seeing then next week, we're going to be beginning looking at Cole's life and other paintings. We're seeing this process of the human condition being symbolized, as it has been, in all kinds of areas. You can see it in music, in film clips. You can see it in art. You can see it in poetry. In all these themes, we are, as it were, so immersed in this life cycle that we cannot help but explore it. So we do well to process this and ask, what does this all mean? How do we interpret our lives? Because we are all in this human condition of birth, growth, decay, and death, and we are inheritors of a larger tradition that goes back. And yet we have to ask ourselves, where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? It's the fundamental questions of life, and what's one's answer to that, and how we explore that. And I want to also talk about a biblical vision and a solution to those problems. But I'm out of time. So therefore, next week I'm going to explore a couple more things and lead into now Cole's paintings, and then into the two series on the voyage of life that he did. And we'll explore that next time. Let me close in a prayer. Father, we thank you that you have called us to be people who understand our times and know what we need to do. I pray that we would gain wisdom so that we would learn from the past, learn from the scriptures, learn from your perspective to see that the kingdoms of this world come and go, but you are preparing an eternal kingdom that will endure. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.